I never thought of myself as someone who kept score. I mean, I always joked about it with my friends. Oh, I'll remember that. But deep down, I tried to avoid letting grudges fester. Life's messy enough, without dragging petty revenge around, but some moments just stick to your chest and refuse to let go, like last week. Or maybe even longer than that. I'm Mira Sandoval. I live in a mid-century apartment building in Portland, Oregon, right on the edge of the east side, where the streets smell faintly of roasted coffee and rain-dampened asphalt. I'm 29 now, and I work in marketing at a small but ambitious tech firm downtown. My job isn't glamorous, but it pays decently and keeps me in the circle of people who appreciate good design, clever campaigns, and the occasional happy hour. I've always been the reliable type, the kind of friend who remembers birthdays, who checks in when your WhatsApp bubbles have gone silent, the girl who shows up on time and leaves her drama at the door. Maybe that's why it hit me harder than it should have. Jake Matthews. He's complicated, if you want to be generous. Tall, dark-haired, with a grin that's somehow both charming and infuriating, like he knows exactly how to make you laugh and cry in the same conversation. We've been together for almost 3 years, and in that time I thought I knew him pretty well. Or maybe I just thought I knew him because I wanted to, because ignoring the little red flags is easier than accepting them. Like the first time he made me feel like I wasn't enough. That night, at some office mixer, when I overheard him laughing with coworkers about the way I overreacted to something trivial. At the time, I shrugged it off. I mean, who wouldn't laugh sometimes? But it planted a seed. And seeds have a way of growing quietly before you notice they've taken over the whole room. We moved into this apartment a year ago, cozy 2-bedroom with a balcony overlooking the tree-lined street, where the neighbors are just chatty enough to feel familiar without being suffocating. I love it here. I've spent evenings hanging strings of fairy lights, rearranging furniture until it felt like a home, and learning how to cook meals that aren't just edible but kind of magical actually. My mother always said the way to someone's heart is through their stomach, and as ridiculous as that sounds, I'd like to think she was onto something. Jake, though, he never appreciated it the way I wanted him to. Not that I asked for praise at every turn. God, no. But there were moments, small ones, when a compliment or a look of genuine awe would have gone a long way. Instead, there was teasing, occasionally subtle, occasionally sharp. He was funny, sure, but there were undertones I couldn't ignore. And then last week's company barbecue happened. That's when the cracks became chasms. We were in our neighborhood park, string lights draping the trees, burgers sizzling on the grill. Everyone from the office was there laughing, awkwardly mingling, exchanging those polite niceties you only say when you're not sure what else to say. I was there with a cup of soda in hand, feeling the weight of my sneakers against the grass, watching Jake as he wandered closer to his coworker, Tiffany. She's new, blonde, bright, a little too eager to be loved. And he was leaning in, laughing at jokes I hadn't heard, his hand brushing hers in ways that made my stomach twist. I smiled. I forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. People were watching. I could feel the neighbors' eyes from across the park, curious and judgy, and my face burned like I'd been hit with a sunburn. My soda felt suddenly heavier than it had any right to be, and I clutched it like a life raft. He didn't see me. He didn't even glance in my direction. And that's when the humiliation hit, creeping up my spine, settling like a stone in my chest. I laughed nervously at a joke someone made, and the sound that came out wasn't my own. It was forced, hollow, echoing the discomfort I felt. That was a week ago. 7 days, 68 hours. And yet every time I think about it, the memory tastes bitter in my mouth. I wanted to confront him, to yell, to demand an explanation, but instead I left the park, heels tapping against the asphalt in the dark, and promised myself I'd think it through. Fast forward to today. I'm standing in the kitchen, my hands moving almost automatically as I dice onions and peppers, chop garlic and measure spices with precision that borders on obsession. I glance down at the sticky post-it note in my hand. Dinner at 8, babe. It reads, in his messy, familiar handwriting. It's casual, flippant, unaware of the storm I've been brewing silently inside me. I laugh softly, a low, dangerous sound that even surprises me. Revenge doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet, meticulous plotting that leaves the deepest mark. And tonight, the mark would be his. The dining room glows as the sun sets, soft shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. I've set the table carefully, candles flickering, glasses polished, the air filled with the scent of garlic, tomato and something unexpected, a hint of mischief maybe. I wear the red dress, the one he once said made me look stunning. It clings in all the right places, sways in all the right ways, and makes me feel untouchable. There's a thrill in preparing for him, in knowing that the evening I've orchestrated will shift the power between us, even if just for a little while. As I check the oven, the chili mac bubbling, the corners of my lips curl into a small satisfied smile. This is the part of life where I take control, where I remind myself that humiliation doesn't have to be endured in silence, that a carefully served dish can speak louder than words ever could. And as the clock ticks toward 8 p.m., I take a slow breath, savoring the calm before the storm, because tonight, Jake will learn that some lessons are best delivered quietly, carefully, and that some dishes indeed are best served cold. The clock's second hand ticked deliberately, each click echoing through the apartment like a drumbeat, reminding me that the moment was approaching. I checked the oven one last time, the chili mac glistening under the golden heat, steam rising like a silent promise. Everything was perfect, the table set, the wine poured, the candles flickering just enough to make the room glow without blinding, and I, in my red dress, felt untouchable. That was my first victory. Control. My domain, the battlefield. I didn't hear the click of the lock at first. I was too focused on the subtle details, adjusting a fork, straightening a napkin, ensuring everything looked effortless, even though I had spent the last 45 minutes obsessing over it. Then the soft shuffle of his footsteps, familiar, yet suddenly invasive, reached my ears. My pulse quickened. Jake walked in, hair slightly tousled, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, a grin on his face that I had once found endearing. "Wow, Mira, this is," he began, eyes scanning the table, the candles, the carefully plated meal, but I cut him off with a smile, small and sweet, practiced and sharp. "Sit, eat," I said simply, my voice calm, but underneath, there was a quiet storm. My chest tightened as I watched him settle into the chair, oblivious to the storm that had been brewing in the shadows of my patience and pride. He dove in, praise spilling over between bites, grinning like a child discovering a hidden candy stack. The chili mac, the dish I had perfected over a week of testing, adjusting, tasting, was his favorite, and it wasn't just the flavor I had perfected, but the subtle additions, the tweaks that would make this meal unforgettable. The Carolina Reaper pepper, not enough to be lethal, but enough to make him sweat, to make him pause, to make him feel, if only for a few minutes, the discomfort he had inflicted on me. Halfway through, I watched him shift uneasily. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline, his fingers brushing the back of his neck. His jaw clenched, and he coughed, grabbing his beer in a desperate attempt to cool the heat racing through his system. "Hot," he wheezed, tugging at his collar. His grin faltered, confusion and pain mingling in his eyes. I leaned in, my voice soft, syrupy. "Oh, honey," I said, watching him squirm. I added a little something extra. "Carolina Reaper peppers. From the backyard you never mow." The recognition hit him like a truck. His eyes widened, watering, his fork trembling. "You." "Shh," I interrupted, standing and letting my heels click softly on the hardwood. I watched him, a mix of disbelief, shame, and heat radiating from his face. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You humiliated me, laughed at me, made me feel like a joke. Now you get to sweat. Fair's fair." I walked away, leaving him choking, grabbing at his beer like it could save him, like the words he hadn't said could be erased by liquid and steam. I let the quiet fill the room, the way it always does when someone finally realizes that the power dynamic has shifted, even if only for a moment. As I moved to the living room, the adrenaline started to ebb, replaced by a cocktail of triumph, reflection, and a strange, hollow satisfaction. It wasn't glee, not really. It was justice served in a way that required patience, planning, and self-control. I thought about that barbecue again, the laughter of co-workers, the whisper of neighbors' voices, the sting of his hand brushing Tiffany's, the absence of his eyes on me. And now, sitting across the room, he was finally seeing a shadow of the discomfort I had carried for a week. I poured myself a glass of wine, the ruby liquid catching the candlelight, and took a slow sip, savoring the taste, savoring the victory. My mind wandered back to the months, even years, leading up to this moment, the subtle disregard, the teasing that masked criticism, the moments that made me question myself, my worth, my patience. The quiet accumulation of all those little humiliations had built into this single perfect crescendo, but even as I reveled in it, a strange twinge crept into my chest. Was it vindictive? Yes. But was it necessary? Maybe I had held the discomfort too long, allowed it to fester, until it became a living thing inside me, demanding expression. The peppers were just the vehicle, the medium. The real message was deeper. I wouldn't be ignored, dismissed, or humiliated without consequence anymore. Jake's coughing finally subsided. He sat, red-faced, eyes watering, fork abandoned on the plate. I could see the realization in his expression, the dawning comprehension that he had underestimated me, that I had thought him capable of carelessness, that I had been too forgiving in the past, too patient, too polite. That ended tonight. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. There was no excuse, no charm that could undo the humiliation he now faced, and I didn't need to say anything else. Silence was louder than any shouting could ever be. Silence carried weight, carried the subtle satisfaction of someone who had waited, planned and executed, with precision. As he fanned his mouth with a napkin, I leaned against the doorway, sipping my wine, letting the scene imprint itself in my memory. I thought about how life has a way of teaching lessons in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's subtle, like a glance or a whisper. Sometimes it's fiery, like this moment, and sometimes it's perfectly cold, delivered with calculated patience, that leaves a mark far deeper than any heated argument ever could. I didn't gloat, I didn't laugh, I let him process, let him feel the heat, the sting, the awareness of his own recklessness, and as I watched him, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly in control, not of him, not of the situation but of myself, because revenge, I realized, isn't about the other person. It's about reclaiming your own power, your own dignity, the self-respect that had been chipped away over months, years even. And in that moment, with the scent of chili and garlic hanging in the air, candles flickering, and Jake struggling to process what had just happened, I felt whole, not triumphant, not gloating, not vindictive in the petty sense, but whole, finally, whole. And that's when I knew this was more than a meal. This was a statement, a reminder that I wouldn't be silenced, dismissed or mocked, that the quiet, subtle power of patience and planning could leave a deeper mark than any shouted confrontation ever could. That night, as I poured another glass of wine and let the warmth spread through me, I realized the breaking point wasn't just what happened at the barbecue. It was every little moment before that, every time I'd swallowed my feelings, every smile I'd forced while my pride ached quietly. Tonight was the culmination. Tonight was the reckoning. The next morning, the apartment felt empty, too quiet. The lingering smell of chili and garlic from the night before still clung stubbornly to the air, a stubborn reminder of the previous evening's theatrics. I hadn't slept much, not because of guilt or anxiety, but because the adrenaline from executing my little plan refused to let me rest. It was strange, that mix of triumph and unease that settles in the chest after a storm. Jake hadn't spoken much since dinner. He left for work early, shuffling around in the kitchen, with the awkwardness of someone who'd learned a lesson but didn't quite know how to process it. No excuses, no apologies, just silence, and an unmistakable awareness that things had changed. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering back to the night, to the way his face had flushed, the way he coughed and fanned his mouth, the way he looked at me with a combination of surprise, shame, and a hint of admiration, though whether that admiration was for me or for the boldness of what I'd done, I wasn't sure. By mid-morning, my phone began buzzing. Messages from friends, some curious, some teasing. You okay? Did Jake survive dinner? We need details. My thumb hovered over the screen, and I realized with a little startle how much I had bottled up. My friends, my colleagues, even my family, they didn't see the little indignities I'd suffered over the past months, the subtle undermining, the small humiliations that accumulated into this storm. I sat at my desk, staring at the spreadsheet I had to finish, and felt a wave of exhaustion. It wasn't physical, not exactly, but emotional, like I'd run a marathon without moving. The act of planning, executing, and holding back the emotions that bubbled up was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Then came the texts from Jake, short, clipped, awkward. Thanks for dinner. Sorry about last week. Can we talk? I stared at them, my pulse fluttering like trapped birds. The temptation to reply was almost unbearable, almost primal, but I didn't. I waited. I let the silence stretch, letting him squirm in his own thoughts a little longer. At work I felt lighter. There was a strange buoyancy, an energy that pulsed through me as if some invisible weight had been lifted. I caught myself smiling more easily, laughing at jokes that might have annoyed me before. It was liberating, intoxicating even, to reclaim some part of myself that I hadn't realized I'd lost to years of subtle dismissals. But not everything was simple. My coworkers, oblivious to the specifics, noticed a change. Some raised eyebrows, whispered behind hands,
curious about the subtle shift in my demeanor. Even Tiffany, the girl from the barbecue, seemed cautious around me, as if sensing a new boundary had been drawn. It was amusing, in a quiet, vindictive sort of way. Still, the aftershocks weren't confined to my home or office. The nights were restless. I found myself replaying scenes in my head, not just from the barbecue, not just from dinner, but from years of minor humiliations, small slights, unspoken insult. Faces blurred, words faded, but the feelings remained: irritation, anger, shame, frustration, and now, they were punctuated with a sense of power. Jake began to shift subtly too. He was quieter, more cautious, more aware. The jokes were toned down, the teasing replaced with consideration. I noticed these changes in small gestures, how he paused before speaking, how he watched my reactions a little more closely, how he no longer assumed my patience was infinite. There was relief in this, yes, but also a lingering unease. Change doesn't come without cost, and the price of this shift in power was not something I had fully reckoned with. Some nights, I caught myself reflecting in the mirror, red dress hanging in the closet like a trophy. Did I go too far? Had I crossed some invisible line? The answer came back to me quietly. Maybe, but only because it had needed to happen. The past week's humiliation had been a spark, but the tinder had been piling up for months, years even, and I had acted not in anger, not in rashness, but in deliberate, calculated reclaiming of self. Family calls were more awkward now too. My mother, always perceptive in subtle ways, noticed something different in my tone, in the confidence that edged my words. "You sound strong," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity and concern. I didn't correct. There was truth in it, but strength can be dangerous when wielded without caution. Even friends began to notice. Some were thrilled, admiring the poise, the cleverness. Others warned me, cautiously, about the dangers of letting revenge define you. And in those moments, I realized the story wasn't just about Jake. It was about me, my patience, my boundaries, my willingness to accept small injustices. The fallout wasn't simply external, it was deeply internal, reshaping how I saw myself and the world around me. And yet there were nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city hum below, and felt a flicker of doubt. Was this empowerment, or was it obsession? Had I drawn a line between justice and cruelty? Even if these thoughts came unbidden, quiet ghosts of reflection, whispering that even calculated acts leave traces on the soul. Work began to take on a sharper focus. I channeled energy into projects, campaigns, deadlines, anything to occupy the restless mind. The clarity I'd gained from asserting myself in a small but potent way bled into every task. People responded differently to me, with a mix of admiration and caution, and I began to navigate the office with a subtle, newly honed confidence. Then came the moment that crystallized the fallout completely. One Thursday afternoon, a week after the Chili Mac incident, Jake approached my desk. He didn't speak immediately, he simply stood there, posture slightly slouched, hands folded in front of him, eyes tracing my. And in that silence, everything that had transpired, the barbecue, the humiliation, the carefully orchestrated dinner, settled between us like a dense fog. "I wanted to say I get it," he finally said, voice hesitant. Not an apology, not a plea, just acknowledgement. And that in itself was a turning point, because acknowledgement doesn't erase the past, but it allows a bridge to form over the rubble. I nodded once, slowly. The conversation didn't need to go further, it never had. The impact was already done, the tables had turned. I had claimed my space, my voice, my power, and in that silence, I realized how fragile the balance of relationships can be, how easily respect can be lost, and how delicately it can be regained. Still, the fallout wasn't just about him, it was about me, my boundaries, my self-respect, the way I now understood that small humiliations could not be ignored, that patience has limits, that subtle calculated actions can be more powerful than loud confrontation. And in that knowledge, I began to see the path forward, not just in my relationship, but in life, in work, in every interaction where my voice and presence had previously been underestimated. By the end of the week, the apartment smelled like baked bread and roasted vegetables rather than chili and fire. Life returned to its rhythms, but the lessons remained. They lingered quietly, subtle reminders that strength isn't always loud, that power can be reclaimed with patience and precision, and that the taste of vindication, served cold or otherwise, leaves a lasting mark, not just on those who wronged you, but on yourself, your confidence, your very sense of self.
After the fallout, something shifted in me. Quietly, but decisively. It wasn't just the satisfaction of seeing Jake squirm, though that still lingered like a small, warm ember. No, it was bigger than that. It was about reclaiming myself, my confidence, my boundaries, my life. And as days turned into weeks, I realized that reclaiming control meant more than just one evening of clever revenge. It meant asserting myself in every corner of my existence, and in ways that weren't merely reactive, but proactive. I started small. At work, I stopped deflecting credit. I began presenting ideas with more confidence, letting my voice carry in meetings rather than nodding silently and hoping someone would notice. There was pushback, of course. Some colleagues bristled, some seemed threatened, but the quiet satisfaction of standing my ground outweighed any fear. I discovered a strength I hadn't fully tapped before, a calm assertiveness that made me feel untouchable in ways that had nothing to do with Jake or revenge. At home, I rearranged the apartment again. This time, it wasn't just about aesthetics. The space became a reflection of my newfound clarity, a sanctuary where I controlled the atmosphere, the energy, the boundaries, candles and soft lighting. Yes, but also subtle touches of personal power, framed photographs of my travels, awards from work, even a small indoor plant that had survived against all odds. Each detail was deliberate. Each detail whispered, "This is mine." And then there was the question of Jake. He was quieter now, careful, measured. I could see him recalculating, wondering where he stood. But I realized that the dynamic we'd shared for years had changed irreversibly. I no longer wanted to play the game on his terms. I wanted to define the rules, and that meant I had to step beyond the single night of revenge and start setting the stage for a more lasting transformation, both for myself and inadvertently for him. I began documenting things, not in a vindictive sense, but as a form of reflection. Notes on conversations, subtle patterns I noticed, moments where I realized I had been dismissive of my own instincts. I traced years of small slights, layering them with recent events, and the picture that emerged wasn't just about Jake. It was about my own limits, my own tolerance, my own growth. I understood now that revenge was a catalyst, but the real work was rebuilding myself from the inside out. The turning point came unexpectedly. I was at a Friday night gathering with close friends, the kind where laughter is genuine and stories are shared without pretension. Someone joked about office dramas, about flirtations gone wrong, and I laughed, but not nervously, not with a shadow over my confidence. I laughed freely, openly, and then it hit me. I wasn't defined by his actions, or by how he made me feel, or even by the meticulous revenge I'd orchestrated. I was defined by how I chose to rise from it. That night I made a plan, a deliberate, quiet plan, not for him, but for myself. I would take control of my emotional landscape, set firm boundaries, and create a life where I wasn't at the mercy of others. And if he chose to cross me again, I would be ready. But more than that, I realized I wanted to embrace joy, authenticity, and clarity without the weight of lingering resentment. One Saturday, I decided to take a bold step. I invited Jake to a casual lunch, neutral territory, nothing formal, no elaborate setup. But this time, the conversation wasn't about revenge or embarrassment. It was about understanding, about acknowledging the past while firmly asserting my own perspective. I told him, carefully, calmly, what I had felt at the barbecue, how small humiliations had accumulated, and how his actions had affected me. And then I listened, really listened, as he attempted to explain, not justify, not excuse, but acknowledge. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward pauses, moments where I wanted to snap, moments where I questioned whether this honesty was worth it. But I felt something shift in me during that conversation. I wasn't angry in the same way anymore. I wasn't plotting or strategizing. I was claiming space for myself, for my dignity, for my voice. And in that claiming, I discovered a kind of liberation I hadn't known existed. The moral conflict wasn't gone. I wrestled with it often. Was it fair to derive satisfaction from his discomfort, even if he had wronged me? Could I trust myself to move forward without letting the shadow of resentment color my decisions? But I realized that acknowledging these conflicts, examining them honestly, and still choosing to act with integrity, that was the true victory. It wasn't just about the chili mac or the blush of embarrassment. It was about transforming my approach to life, relationships, and self-respect. As weeks passed, the apartment smelled of baked bread, fresh herbs, and roasted vegetables more often than chili. Jake's presence became less fraught. We communicated, tentatively, but steadily, navigating the new boundaries I had set. And in the quiet moments, early mornings, late nights, solitary walks, I reflected on how much had changed, not because of a single meal, but because I had taken action, reclaimed control, and refused to let small humiliations dictate my life. Evenings became a time for me reading, cooking, experimenting with flavors and recipes that brought me joy. I learned that nurturing myself, asserting myself, and taking deliberate steps to control my own narrative was more satisfying than any fleeting moment of revenge. I found a rhythm, a balance, a confidence that didn't rely on him or anyone else to validate my worth. And yet I never forgot the lessons. The barbecue, the embarrassment, the carefully served chili mac, they remained touchstones. They reminded me that patience, planning, and strategic action can yield profound outcomes. But they also reminded me that the true measure of strength isn't the discomfort you can inflict. It's the dignity you can reclaim, the boundaries you can assert, and the self-respect you can rebuild from moments of quiet suffering. By the end of the month, I felt like a different person, not bitter, not vengeful, but aware, prepared, and unapologetically myself. The turning of the tables wasn't just about him. It was about me, about realizing my power, asserting my worth, and understanding that life's small humiliations need not define the trajectory of one's life. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the careful planning, the subtle triumphs, and the quiet reflection, I discovered a new mantra: control your narrative, honor your boundaries, and never underestimate the power of patience paired with precision. Because when you combine those things, life, like a perfectly served dish, can turn in your favor in ways you never imagined. Time has a funny way of softening some edges while sharpening others. Months passed after the chili mac incident, each day layering new experiences over the rawness of that night. Life settled into a rhythm that felt steadier, more grounded, and yet the memory of that night, the power, the planning, the quiet thrill of reclaiming myself, never faded. It had become a part of me, a benchmark for the way I would navigate my world from now on. Jake and I continued to coexist in a new dynamic. We weren't perfect. There were awkward moments, occasional missteps, small reminders of the person he had been, the careless actions that had brought us to that point. But the major shift had occurred. He treated me differently, not out of fear, but out of respect. I didn't need constant reassurance, and he no longer assumed my patience was limitless. That alone was a kind of peace I hadn't anticipated. I realized, too, that the resolution of that incident had nothing to do with revenge anymore. The chili mac was a tool, a vehicle, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been building for years. The real resolution came from within, my ability to recognize what I would no longer tolerate, my decision to assert myself, and my choice to shape my own narrative, instead of letting others define it. The apartment, once a stage for calculated revenge, became a sanctuary for growth. I experimented more with cooking, not as a weapon but as a joy. Evenings were spent with friends or in quiet reflection, and I found myself laughing more freely, unburdened by the subtle insecurities that had clung to me for so long. I realized that reclaiming dignity wasn't a single act. It was a series of small, deliberate choices, each one reinforcing the last. Work thrived. My confidence translated into better presentations, stronger relationships with colleagues, and a renewed sense of professional purpose. The office politics that once drained me now felt manageable. I had learned to assert myself without aggression, to communicate without hesitation, and to value my own perspective, without needing constant validation. In many ways, that night's calculated act of revenge had become a lesson in life mastery, and yet the memory remained vivid. I could still recall the first bite of that chili mac, the flash of recognition in Jake's eyes, the sharp heat that had mirrored the sting of humiliation. It was oddly poetic in retrospect, how a simple meal could encapsulate years of subtle suffering, patience,
And finally, self-assertion. It reminded me that the most effective victories are often quiet, precise, and deeply personal. One evening, as I cleaned the kitchen and stacked the last of the dishes, I paused and smiled to myself. The apartment smelled faintly of roasted peppers, herbs, and a hint of lingering garlic, the scent of past battles, yes, but also of mastery, of control, of reclaimed joy. I realized that life doesn't always hand you the respect you deserve. Sometimes you have to take it in small, deliberate increments, like arranging a meal that leaves a lasting impression. I thought of Jay, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the role he had played in my growth. He had been the catalyst, the mirror reflecting what I had tolerated for too long, and for that, oddly enough, I was grateful. The incident had taught me more about myself than any calm, uneventful relationship could have. I had discovered patience, precision, courage, and the ability to act decisively when the moment demanded it. I also realized something else. The lesson wasn't about him or the embarrassment, or the perfect execution of revenge. It was about me, about recognizing my worth, embracing my strength, and understanding that life, much like a carefully prepared dish, is best approached with a combination of patience, skill, and self-respect. Some lessons are best delivered in silence, some victories are best savored privately, and some boundaries are worth more than any temporary satisfaction of retaliation. Months later, I looked back at that night, not as a moment of cruelty but as a turning point, a reminder that control over one's life, dignity, and self-respect is not negotiable. That realization seeped into every interaction, every decision, every quiet evening spent at home. I found myself more confident, more deliberate, more unafraid to assert my presence in a world that sometimes seemed determined to overlook it. The resolution, I understood, was not in the humiliation I had orchestrated, nor in the heat of the chilly match. It was in the reclaiming of my own power, the clarity of my choices, and the unshakable understanding that I would never again allow subtle slights or careless disregard to define me. Life had given me the tools, and I had used them not out of spite, but out of a deep, hard-earned wisdom about boundaries, self-respect, and the quiet art of personal empowerment. I still laugh when I think about it. Not at him, not in mockery, but in recognition of how far I've come, how carefully I've learned to navigate life, and how even the smallest acts, when planned with patience and intention, can shift the balance in profound ways. The dish had been served cold, yes, but the lesson it carried had warmed me from within, and as I pour myself a glass of wine sitting in the apartment that now feels like a true reflection of who I am, I smile. The story isn't about revenge anymore, it's about growth, resilience, and the subtle, enduring power of taking control of one's own life. And in that I've found a kind of peace, a satisfaction, and a confidence that no moment of humiliation or petty betrayal could ever take away. Life, like a perfectly prepared meal, is best approached with patience, care, and respect for oneself. And I've learned that sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that last the longest.